The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed to capacity that Tuesday afternoon. Every seat was filled with reporters, staffers, and observers who sensed something explosive was about to unfold. Stephen Miller, the former Trump senior advisor and chief architect of the administration's most controversial immigration policies, sat at the witness table. Jaw clenched, eyes scanning the committee like a hawk circling its territory. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas adjusted her microphone. Her expression remained calm, but the spark in her eyes betrayed a quiet determination. What no one anticipated was that over the next 30 minutes, Miller would interrupt Crockett 6 times, each attempt more aggressive than the last. And yet, it would be her 7th statement, delivered with surgical precision and unwavering composure, that left him completely speechless and shifted the entire dynamic of the hearing. Within minutes, the moment would go viral, racking up millions of views and igniting a national conversation about respect, power, and who truly controls the narrative in American politics. Before diving into this incredible showdown, it's worth understanding who these two figures are and why their clash seemed inevitable the moment Miller took his seat. At 38, Stephen Miller had built his political career on being the unflinching voice of hardline immigration policy. As Trump's senior advisor and chief speechwriter, he was the architect of some of the administration's most controversial initiatives: the family separation policy at the border, the Muslim travel ban, and a host of other deterrence-based strategies. Miller was infamous in Washington for his combative style, refusing to back down, dominating conversations with rapid-fire talking points, and locking eyes with opponents until they faltered. He had faced senators, congressmen, and high-profile journalists, and almost always emerged with his reputation for dominance intact. Facing him across the committee table was Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas who had quickly earned a reputation as one of the sharpest questioners in the House. At 42, Crockett brought a rare combination of courtroom skill and political savvy. A former civil rights attorney and public defender, she was no stranger to hostile witnesses. Her district included parts of Dallas and its suburbs, areas directly affected by the very immigration policies Miller had designed. For Crockett, this hearing was more than political theater. It was personal. The committee was investigating the long-term effects of Trump-era immigration policies, particularly the family separation policy that had ripped thousands of children from their parents at the border. Newly released documents revealed that officials knew the separations would cause deep psychological harm, but proceeded anyway. Miller had been subpoenaed to testify about his role in creating and implementing those policies. He arrived armed with statistics, rehearsed lines, and his trademark aggressive debating style. To Miller, this was an opportunity to defend his legacy and reaffirm his vision of an immigration system built on deterrence and strict enforcement. For Crockett, the stakes were higher than policy. She had toured detention facilities, met separated families, and witnessed the trauma inflicted on children as young as infants. As a black woman in Congress, she also understood the gendered dynamic of power, what it meant to face down powerful men who believed they could talk over you, interrupt you, and dismiss your authority. Miller was the embodiment of every man she had confronted in courtrooms and council chambers, men who mistook volume for wisdom and interruption for intelligence. The hearing room pulsed with tension. Behind Miller sat a phalanx of advisors and lawyers, all in dark suits, their faces tight with anticipation. Behind Crockett sat her staff and a gallery of immigration advocates, some wearing shirts bearing the images of separated children. Network cameras were trained on the witness table. Major outlets had interrupted regular programming to carry the proceedings live. Committee Chairman Jim Jordan gavelled the hearing to order at 2 p.m. sharp, already struggling to contain the restless audience. Democrats prepared to grill Miller on his record. Republicans readied counterattacks focused on current border issues. But everyone in that room knew the true showdown would come when the gentlewoman from Texas took the microphone. For 20 tense minutes, other members sparred with Miller. He batted away Democratic questions with rehearsed pivots and rapid-fire monologues, speaking over his interrogators and reframing every query to his advantage. Republican allies tossed him softballs, allowing him to extol the virtues of border security and portray himself as a misunderstood patriot. Then Chairman Jordan announced, "The chair recognizes the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes." The room seemed to hold its breath. Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. "Mr. Miller, thank you for being here today. I want to start with a simple question. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy resulted in documented psychological trauma to thousands of children?" Miller pounced immediately. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is that the policy was about border security and—" "Mr. Miller," Crockett began, but he continued over her, raising his voice. "The real trauma is caused by human traffickers exploiting these children and the previous administration's failures." Crockett raised her voice slightly, but kept her composure. "Mr. Miller, I'm asking a specific question about documented trauma. The documentation you refer to," Miller interrupted again, "comes from biased sources that ignore the broader context." "This is my time," Crockett said firmly, "and I would appreciate—" "The border crisis was created by years of failed policies that I and President Trump sought to fix when people like you—" Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Chairman Jordan tapped his gavel half-heartedly. "The witness will allow the member to ask her question." Miller leaned back slightly but kept his eyes locked on Crockett, jaw working. She calmly shuffled her papers as if his interruptions were mere inconveniences. "Mr. Miller," she continued, "I have here a memo from your own Department of Health and Human Services stating that family separation would cause, and I quote, significant and long-lasting psychological damage to children. This is your administration's own assessment. Do you dispute this?" "What I dispute," Miller shot back without pause, "is the characterization that we didn't care about children when, in fact, the memo clearly states—" Crockett tried again. "The Obama administration built the cages," Miller barked. "They separated families. They just lacked the courage to admit that strong border enforcement requires tough decisions." The gallery stirred. Several Democratic members shook their heads. Even some Republicans looked uneasy. Crockett remained perfectly composed, jotting notes on her legal pad as Miller powered through his filibuster. When he finally paused for breath, she moved quickly. "Mr. Miller, I understand you have talking points you're eager to share, but I'm asking about specific documents from your own administration." "My administration saved lives," Miller nearly shouted. "My administration stopped the child trafficking that you seem determined to ignore." "Mr. Chairman," Crockett said calmly, turning to Jordan, "I would ask that the witness be instructed to allow me to use my time to ask questions." Jordan tapped the gavel again, weakly. "Mr. Miller, please allow the Congresswoman to ask her questions." Miller sat back, face flushed, hands gripping the table's edge. Camera shutters clicked. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Crockett looked directly at him, her voice steady as steel. "Mr. Miller, I have been a civil rights attorney. I have been a public defender. I have stood in courtrooms across this country, and I have never—" "Your experience in courtrooms," Miller cut in, dripping with condescension, "doesn't give you expertise in national security or border enforcement." "Congresswoman, the reality is—" But this time something shifted. Crockett didn't attempt to speak over him. She didn't appeal to the chair. She simply sat back, crossed her arms, and waited. Miller continued for another 30 seconds, filling the chamber with a rapid-fire rant about border security and Democratic failures. When he finally stopped, perhaps expecting her to interject, Crockett remained silent. 1 beat, 2. The silence grew heavy, almost physical. The entire room leaned forward. Then she spoke, her voice low but resonant. "Mr. Miller, you have now interrupted me 6 times. 6 times you have shown this committee, the American people watching at home, and everyone in this room exactly who you are." Miller opened his mouth, but Crockett raised a single finger. Something in her expression made him pause. "You see," she continued, her voice gaining strength without rising in volume, "men like you have been interrupting women like me our entire lives. You interrupt because you believe your voice is more important. You interrupt because you think volume equals validity. And you interrupt because, deep down, you know that if you actually had to—" Answer my questions. If you had to confront the documented evidence of the trauma you caused to thousands of children, your carefully constructed narrative would crumble, like a house of cards in a hurricane. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Miller's face shifted from red to pale. His lawyers sat frozen behind him, unsure whether to object or remain still. Crockett calmly pulled a stack of documents from her folder and laid them on the table one by one. Since you seem incapable of allowing me to ask about these documents properly, let me tell you what they actually say. This memo from your Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services states that children as young as 8 months old were separated from their mothers. 8 months old. This report from your own Customs and Border Protection shows that your team had no system in place to reunite these families. She slid the papers across the table, her eyes never leaving his. Miller said nothing. The silence spoke louder than any outburst could. The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed to capacity on that tense Tuesday afternoon. Every seat was filled with reporters, staffers, and observers who sensed something explosive was about to unfold. At the witness table sat Stephen Miller, former senior advisor to Donald Trump and the chief architect of the administration's most controversial immigration policies. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the committee members like a hawk surveying its territory. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, calmly adjusting her microphone. Her face showed composure, but her eyes burned with determination. No one in the room could have predicted that, in the next 30 minutes, Miller would interrupt Crockett 6 separate times, each interruption more aggressive than the last, only to be dismantled by her 7th and final statement. It was a line delivered with surgical precision, a statement so sharp and undeniable that it left Miller speechless and changed the entire dynamic of the hearing. Within minutes, the confrontation would go viral, racking up millions of views and sparking a nationwide conversation about respect, power, and who truly controls the narrative in American politics. Before understanding the clash, it's important to know the two players. Miller, 38, had built his entire political career on being the unyielding face of hardline immigration policy. As Trump's senior advisor and chief speechwriter, he designed some of the administration's most infamous policies, including the Muslim travel ban and the family separation policy that tore thousands of children from their parents at the border. Miller was known in Washington circles for his combative style, rapid-fire talking points, and his ability to dominate any conversation through sheer force of will. Opposite him was Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas, but hardly a political novice. At 42, Crockett had already forged a formidable reputation as a civil rights attorney and former public defender. Her courtroom experience taught her how to handle hostile witnesses and remain unshaken under pressure. Her district included parts of Dallas directly affected by the immigration policies Miller had helped craft. For Crockett, this hearing was not just about policy, it was personal. The stakes were enormous. The committee was investigating the long-term impact of Trump-era immigration actions, particularly the family separation policy that resulted in thousands of children being taken from their parents at the border. Recently released documents showed the administration knew of the psychological damage the policy would cause, but moved forward anyway. Miller had been called to testify about his role in creating and implementing these actions. For Miller, this was an opportunity to defend his legacy. He arrived prepared with carefully rehearsed talking points, a stack of statistics, and the aggressive debating style he had used to outmaneuver senators, congressmen, and reporters for years. For Crockett, this was about exposing the human cost behind those cold statistics. She had visited detention facilities, met separated families, and witnessed firsthand the trauma inflicted on children as young as 8 months old. The tension in the room was palpable. Behind Miller sat a team of advisors and lawyers, all in dark suits, their faces set and watchful. Behind Crockett were staff members and immigration advocates, including families directly affected by Miller's policies. Several wore shirts displaying images of separated children. The C-SPAN cameras were rolling, and major news networks interrupted regular programming to cover the hearing live. Committee Chairman Jim Jordan gavelled the hearing to order at 2 p.m. sharp. Democrats prepared to grill Miller on the moral and legal failures of family separation, while Republicans readied their defenses, eager to pivot the discussion to current border issues. But everyone knew the real showdown would be between Miller and Crockett. For 20 tense minutes, other members questioned Miller. He deflected with lightning speed, pivoting to his prepared statistics and framing every challenge as a matter of border security. Republican members tossed him softballs, allowing him to paint himself as a misunderstood patriot. Democratic members tried to corner him on specific memos, but Miller, true to form, talked over them and reframed questions to his advantage. Finally, Chairman Jordan announced, "The chair recognizes the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Crockett." For 5 minutes, the room seemed to hold its breath. Crockett leaned forward, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Miller, thank you for being here today. I want to start with a simple question. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy resulted in documented psychological trauma to thousands of children?" Miller's response came instantly, a rapid-fire burst. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is that the policy was about border security." "Mr. Miller," Crockett began again, but he kept talking over her. "The real trauma is caused by human traffickers exploiting these children and by previous administrations that incentivized illegal crossings." Crockett raised her voice slightly, her composure unshaken. "Mr. Miller, I'm asking a specific question about documented trauma." He interrupted again. "The documentation you reference comes from biased sources that refuse to recognize the broader context of—" "Mr. Miller," she said firmly, "this is my time." The interruptions kept coming. By the 5th time he cut her off, Miller was practically shouting, insisting his administration had saved lives and stopped child trafficking. Crockett remained calm, requesting Chairman Jordan to instruct the witness to allow her to ask her questions. Jordan half-heartedly complied, but Miller continued to bulldoze through her statements. Finally, after Miller's 6th interruption, Crockett shifted her strategy. She simply stopped speaking. Arms crossed, eyes locked on Miller, she let the silence hang heavy. The entire room seemed to freeze as Miller ranted on for another 30 seconds, unaware he was digging his own grave. When he finally paused, expecting her to jump back in, Crockett remained silent for a beat, then another. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but carried a razor's edge. "Mr. Miller, you have now interrupted me 6 times. 6 times you have shown this committee, the American people, and everyone in this room exactly who you are." Miller started to open his mouth, but Crockett raised a single finger and something in her expression made him stop. "You see," she continued, her tone steady but gathering power. "Men like you have been interrupting women like me our entire lives. You interrupt because you believe your voice is more important. You interrupt because you think volume equals validity. You interrupt because deep down, you know that if you actually had to answer my questions, if you actually had to confront the documented evidence of the trauma you caused, your carefully constructed narrative would crumble. Like a house of cards in a hurricane." The room fell silent. Miller's face, once flushed with aggression, paled. Behind him, his lawyers sat frozen, unsure whether to object or stay silent. Crockett methodically pulled out document after document from her folder and laid them on the desk. "This memo from your own. Department of Health and Human Services states that children as young as 8 months old were separated from their mothers. 8 months old. And this email chain, which includes your name, shows you dismissing concerns about the psychological impact because, and I quote, the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations." She paused, looking up at him. "Other considerations, Mr. Miller?" "Those other considerations were children, babies, toddlers, kids who will carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. And you knew it. You all knew it. And you did it anyway." The gallery erupted. Some people were crying. Others nodded fiercely. Chairman Jordan pounded his gavel, calling for order, but Crockett was not finished. "But here's what really matters," she said, her voice rising with quiet authority. "You can interrupt me all you want. You can try to talk over me, dismiss me, diminish me, but I am still here. Those children are still traumatized. Those families are still broken. And you, Mr. Miller, are still responsible." Then came the 7th line. the one that would ricochet across social media and into the history books. Crockett leaned forward, her gaze locked on Miller, and delivered it with devastating precision. "You may have had the power to separate families, Mr. Miller, but you do not have the power to separate yourself from the consequences of your cruelty. Interrupting me 6 times doesn't change the fact that history has already judged you and found you wanting. Your legacy isn't strength. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from. And no amount of interruptions will ever drown that out." The room exploded. Gasps and applause broke out as Miller's face turned ghostly pale. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. For the first time in his career, the man who prided himself on never being silenced sat in stunned silence. Chairman Jordan asked if Miller wished to respond. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and halting. I stand by the policies of the Trump administration. We were protecting America. It was weak. Everyone in the room knew it. Even Miller seemed to know it. Crockett simply replied, "Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Miller's silence speaks louder than any words he could offer." Slow, deliberate applause spread through the gallery. Several Democratic members yielded their questioning time, recognizing that nothing they could say would be more powerful than what had just transpired. Outside the hearing room, the impact was immediate and seismic. Within an hour, the video of Crockett's takedown had been viewed over 10 million times across social media platforms. News networks interrupted programming to replay the moment in full. CNN's Anderson Cooper called it one of the most extraordinary exchanges ever witnessed in a congressional hearing. Even conservative commentators struggled to defend Miller. Fox News host Tucker Carlson admitted Miller walked into a trap today. Former President Barack Obama tweeted, "Representative Jasmine Crockett showed the country what grace under pressure looks like." She reminded us that the voices of those harmed by cruel policies will not be silenced. President Biden released a statement praising Crockett's powerful defense of human dignity. Meanwhile, Miller's usual allies offered tepid responses or none at all. Senator Ted Cruz brushed it off with, "I didn't watch the hearing," while others avoided reporters entirely. Crockett's office was flooded with calls and emails of support. Her social media following skyrocketed by hundreds of thousands within hours. Immigration advocacy groups seized on the moment, printing her 7th line on T-shirts, protest signs, and hashtags that trended for days. Legal experts praised her brilliance in entering damning documents into the congressional record while exposing Miller's character in real time. Behind the bluster and the viral memes, the substance remained. Evidence that the administration had known its policies would cause lasting psychological harm to children and chose to proceed anyway. Lawrence Tribe, the renowned constitutional law professor, summed it up best. Representative Crockett didn't just embarrass Stephen Miller. She exposed the cruelty at the heart of his policies and entered crucial evidence into the record, all while demonstrating how preparation and principle can dismantle even the most aggressive opponent. In a single, unforgettable hearing, Jasmine Crockett transformed a routine oversight session into a defining moment of political accountability, one that will echo far beyond the walls of that packed committee room. The cultural impact of Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Stephen Miller went far beyond a single congressional hearing. What happened in that room quickly became a national teaching moment about power, interruption, and respect. Women's rights groups seized on the viral clip as a textbook example of how men use interruption as a tool of dominance and how women can fight back with preparation and composure. The hashtag #LeatherSpeak began trending across social media as women from every profession shared their own stories of being talked over, dismissed or sidelined in meetings and hearings. Corporate diversity and inclusion trainers even began using the video in workshops. This is what we mean when we talk about microaggressions becoming macroaggressions, explained Dr. Kenji Iono, director of the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at NYU Law School. Miller's interruptions weren't just rude. They were an attempt to deny Congresswoman Crockett her legitimate authority. Her response should be required viewing for anyone who wants to understand power dynamics in professional settings. A week after the hearing, the longer-term political implications were already becoming clear. Stephen Miller's influence inside conservative circles suffered a visible blow. Republican candidates who once sought his endorsement quietly distanced themselves. His lucrative speaking fees, often six figures, began to dry up as organizations hesitated to invite someone now branded by a viral defeat. Even more significant, the exchange thrust the Trump administration's family separation policy back into the national spotlight. The Biden administration responded by announcing new efforts to reunite families who remained separated. Members of Congress introduced bills to provide compensation to affected families and to ensure that such policies could never be implemented again. Representative Crockett used her sudden platform carefully. She refused to gloat or revel in the attention, instead focusing on concrete policy. Within weeks, she introduced the Family Protection Act, legislation prohibiting family separation at the border except in cases of documented abuse or trafficking. The bill gained rare bipartisan support, with several Republicans signing on as co-sponsors eager to distance themselves from the toxic legacy of the Trump-era policy. Crockett also began mentoring young women entering politics, particularly women of color. Speaking to a group of young black leaders at a Houston conference, she reminded them, "What happened in that hearing room wasn't just about me and Stephen Miller. It was about every woman who's ever been told to be quiet, to wait her turn, to let the men talk. You don't have to accept that. You have every right to be heard, to be respected, and to hold powerful people accountable." The hearing also sparked a renewed journalistic investigation into the Trump administration's immigration record. Inspired by the documents Crockett revealed, reporters filed a wave of new Freedom of Information Act requests. Several whistleblowers came forward with additional evidence about how the family separation policy was developed and implemented. 3 months later, a comprehensive report from the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General confirmed much of Crockett's case. Investigators found that senior officials, including Miller, had been repeatedly warned about the psychological trauma family separation would cause, yet pressed forward anyway, viewing the trauma itself as part of the deterrent effect they sought. Miller tried to stage a comeback, publishing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal defending his record and accusing Crockett of grandstanding for viral fame. But the piece drew little more than criticism for its defensive tone and failure to address the evidence she had placed into the congressional record. A year later, the moment was still echoing through American politics and culture. The exchange was featured in an award-winning documentary about immigration policy that included interviews with Crockett and several families directly affected by the separations. Miller declined to participate. Political science professors began adding the Crockett-Miller confrontation to their syllabi. This is a perfect example of how preparation, composure, and moral clarity can overcome aggressive tactics and interruption, said Dr. Jennifer Lawless of the University of Virginia. Crockett didn't try to outshout Miller or match his aggression. She used his behavior against him and made a moral argument that transcended politics. The ripple effects even reached other congressional hearings. Witnesses who tried Miller's aggressive interruption tactics found themselves quickly shut down, with committee members invoking the Crockett example as a warning. What began as a tense 5-minute exchange ultimately became a case study in accountability and the power of calm persistence. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She helped shift the conversation on immigration, gender dynamics, and political courage, proving that preparation and truth can outlast even the loudest voices.